So welcome everybody to this webinar. I'll now give the floor to Dr. Meenakshi, Chair of the Asia Student Research Committee of the International Association for Political Science Students, to deliver her welcome address. Please, dear participants, switch off your microphones, and you can write your questions in the chat box, and there will be a Q&A time at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. First of all, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. It's my extreme pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Kerry Brown, on behalf of the IAPSS community and especially of Asia and Oceania SRC. We are really obliged to have Professor Brown for taking time out and being here today. We extend our warm welcome to Professor Brown and all the participants. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. Over to you, Antonio.
Okay, so today's speaker is Professor Kerry Brown. He is currently Professor of Chinese Studies at King's College, London, and Director of the Loud China Institute. He previously worked as Chatham House as head of the Asia program, and from 1998 to 2005, he worked at the British Foreign Commonwealth Office as First Secretary at the British Embassy in Beijing. Among the many lectures and speeches he delivered about contemporary China and China's rise, noteworthy are the ones at Oxford Union, the National Committee on US-China Relations, and TED Talks. So it's an honor for the Asia Student Research Committee to have such an internationally renowned keynote speaker. So I now call upon Professor Brown to deliver his lecture. Professor Brown, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. I think the idea is that I talk for about 35 minutes on the broad issue of US-China relations, and then I'll be happy to take questions or points of view, however you want to kind of conduct the final few minutes. I mean, the US-China relationship is obviously a very big and important relationship. I mean, that's self-evident. I think the way that China at the moment sees the world is that there's probably four kind of rings around it. The first ring is the US-China relationship because it's the biggest in terms of trade, kind of economic cooperation, and also because it is the most geopolitically important. And I think in that framework, America and China both see themselves as Pacific powers, Asia-Pacific powers. I mean, we tend to see America from Europe as being an Atlantic power. We do forget that America is sort of looking in two ways, quite uniquely, looks in two ways. It does look to the Pacific and it looks to the Atlantic. And I think the Pacific is more and more important to it, and the Atlantic seems to be less and less important these days. So, you know, beyond that kind of realm, China also has in the second kind of ring road around it, I guess you'd say the region, the Asian region, that's caught in this idea of the Belt and Road that it's been kind of talking about in the last few years. Beyond that, in the third kind of region, the third sort of zone of China's interests are the Europeans, because it's such a huge economic relationship. And then beyond that is pretty much the rest of the world, Latin America, Africa, Middle East. I mean, you know, there's nowhere really where China doesn't have some kind of footprint. And so we're living in the era of global China. I think that's pretty clear. This is the era of global China, and it's creating all sorts of structural and political and geopolitical challenges, some of which I think are being sorted out, some of which are getting more deeper, and some of which potentially might not be solvable. So that's really what I'm going to talk about today. You know, how do we deal with this very particular challenge? So the US-China relationship, if my first proposition is that it is the most important geopolitical relationship in the world at the moment, and likely to continue to be so, with America the #1 military and economic power, and China the #2 military and economic power. I mean, how do we, you know, what kind of issues does that throw up? Well, I guess we've got to be very clear about what is the key challenge. You know, why is it that China's rise is a problem to the United States and to others, to the United States allies? You know, why is it a problem? So, I mean, people talk a lot about the problem of US-China relations, but they're often talking about very different things. One is that sometimes people are talking about China in a way as though it wanted to replace the United States as a kind of global police person, and that it wanted to become the new kind of, global powerhouse, the sort of unipolar kind of power, rather than wanting to work within multipolarity. Others talk about China as more of a problem because it's not really a stakeholder. It does things its own way. It's an exceptionist, and it's sort of, creates a messiness around international situations. And then there's the sort of third, which I think see China as profoundly threatening in terms of its values. It's a communist country. It kind of sort of holds to political values which are clearly very, very different to the United States and its alliances. And this is obviously a huge problem for the kind of, the process of modernization for much of the rest of the world. The idea really is that with economic development, at some point you get political change, and the political change is going to lead to democracies, multi-party sort of federalist, kind of systems. And China has kind of proved so far that that's not the case. As of today, there is no sign that China is going to adopt a political model like the United States. I mean, it may be tomorrow, but tomorrow we don't know what's going to happen. We do know what's happening today. My feeling is that it's not likely in the foreseeable future that China will change to a democratic system, or even that if it were to make a change, it would look remotely like the systems that exist elsewhere. Everyone's sort of democratic politics is slightly different to everyone else's, and there are very, very many variables in the Chinese case from history and from economics, from its geography, that mean it is likely that whatever happens in China, and I think there probably will be some kind of reform, it is not going to lead to a very obvious outcome. So what is the key challenge? Of all of those various big issues, what is the key challenge? I suppose for me, I don't think, first of all, that China is looking to replace the United States as a global police person. I don't think it has that desire because, firstly, it's aware that its value system and identity is different to the rest of the world, the rest of the democratic world anyway. And there's no easy way for China to speak to that world in a way that is kind of understandable. I mean, its difference is its kind of big problem. China comes along with a very different cultural and political and kind of historic outlook, and that means it's difficult to communicate anyway, just without thinking about all of the other issues about its political system and the fact that it is communist and America is kind of a democracy. Even if you took away that and just accepted they're both different, there's going to be issues. There's going to be problems really in trying to deal with these, communicating with each other. So I think China is aware of that. It knows that, and it therefore doesn't seek to have a kind of global dominant position because that would be a great deal of trouble for it. But I think it does obviously want a particular space. Now, what kind of space that is, obviously, is what we are seeing negotiated at the moment. But it does want a kind of space. So I think that the problem of China is probably best expressed by the final two things I've just talked about. The first is that it is a deeply self-interested power. It goes along with international rules and regulations when they suit it, but it doesn't really hold to their underlying values. It's not really a believer in the sort of universalist values of for instance, the West. It's a late arriver, so a lot of the kind of post-World War II order expressed through the Bretton Woods and all of these other kind of structures, China has engaged with them, like it has with the World Trade Organization, for instance, on the basis of self-interest. But I think it's kind of not really believing deeply in their underlying values of openness, freedom of expression, kind of a universal legal system, that is more than just about, property and commercial law. I think China has huge reservations and doesn't sign up to that. So the first problem with China's rise is that it is a very deeply self-interested actor. The second, I think, is about its values. It's not, the problem is that, China is one of, you could say India or other major countries. China's not just a geographical space, it's obviously a kind of cultural outlook, a language, and a view of the world, which is very different to, particularly the dominant powers at the moment, the United States and Europe. And, even if there were less contentious issues between the two, it would still be a difficult thing. The fact that they are believing in different things, and there is no easy way to kind of mediate between them. There's no upper court of human values where you can go to and say, how do these two talk to each other? There's no, there's not a straightforward way of really these two having a dialogue where they can create a kind of consensus. So, that alone is a structural challenge. It's this I think is really where we are hitting big problems, because, this is not something where you can see an easy winner coming out of. It's not a game where you can kind of, see clearly that there's a route to winning by one or the other. It's like they're playing two different games on the same pitch with sometimes similar rules, but sometimes different rules. And there's no real referee. There's two or three referees, and there's no real way of working out, who's going to score and who's not going to score. This is clearly a very complex situation. There are no kind of clear, there's no simple sort of ground rules for this. Now, all of that finally would be not so problematic were that China weren't such a dominant economy. So the thing that I think has really created greater urgency and sort of problems about this is that under the communist system that it has, a sort of Chinese characteristics communism, very hybrid and particular system, under that, it has actually been economically fantastically successful, certainly in the last 40 years. And this is the sort of thing that really creates problems, because were China to be a less significant economy, I think we could kind of basically find ways of managing this issue. It would be a problem, but it would, because it's a huge population and a huge country, but it would still, not be as massive a problem as it is now, because China is now the world's second biggest economy, and it is quite likely in the next 10 years, maybe even sooner, to become the world's biggest economy. So, sometime in that period, we're going to end up with this incredible position of the best performing capitalist economy being run by a communist government. So this is somewhat ironic, somewhat of a contradiction. And I think that's really what we're all trying to work out. What does this mean? Because you cannot deny the size and importance of the Chinese economy. And if you don't want to engage or deal with China, you have to walk away from the benefits of that. And it's increasingly difficult to do so. But you also have to recognize that dealing with the economy of China is not a very likely route, doesn't seem to be a very likely route to making China change to become more like the West. By the West, I mean Europe and America, basically. So this is the quandary we're at. In the last 40 years, I think, led by the Americans, the West has basically engaged with China, I think, on the terms of economic relationships will ultimately lead to political change, and that China will become like the sort of European powers that at the end of the kind of 1980s into the 1990s, and the Central Asian powers in the kind of 2000s and the color revolutions, that these sort of changed to political systems which were more pluralistic and democratic. And this was always the kind of rationale, that you dealt with China in order to have these kind of outcomes. And I think that's now very hard to believe. You have to deal with China with the very, very likely outcome that it is not going, as I said, to change in any obvious way politically, that it might in fact become even stronger. And, in what way is that kind of collaborating, with the system in ways which are against the interests of the West? I suppose the only thing I'd say to that kind of argument, before I talk about some other issues, is it's sort of too late, I guess, to start saying that you should no longer cooperate with China. In many areas, to cooperate with China means getting access to technologies and things there which are kind of superior. In many ways, China is pulling ahead. Artificial intelligence, stem cell research, these sorts of things. It's pretty kind of advanced now. So this idea that there's a deficit and the deficit is in the interests of the West is clearly no longer wholly true. I mean, in some areas it might still be, but in a lot of areas it isn't. But the second is obviously with the impact of COVID-19, the economic kind of situation of America, Europe, many other places is pretty bad. China is possibly going to be able to pull out of this economic problem more quickly. I mean, it still has massive economic problems, but it's likely to, it seems at the moment, with the sort of latest quarter of growth that, it's managed to kind of deliver some growth, which is better than America or, Europe are doing. In that situation, it's much more difficult to just ignore the benefits of working economically with China, because when you're economically so weakened and challenged, can you really ignore the world's second biggest economy? You also have to acknowledge, I suppose, that the greatest economic resource that China has is its people, and the rise of the middle class there. How do you define them? I mean, I know there's different definitions for the middle class, but the rise of the middle class means that you have a set of potential customers, clients, users of your services, which might number 500-600 million, and that have more, kind of capacity to grow than anywhere else on the planet. So this is a big thing to kind of walk away from. And it's a massive strategic decision, which in the last 30 years, certainly no one has really managed to do, to actually totally walk away from China and say, we are not dealing with this place at all. I can't think of anyone who's really done that. So this is the sort of question, at the moment, can we really do that? I mean, that's what it seems like America and others are saying, that there's areas where they'll walk away. But I mean, it seems to me a very kind of incomplete and partial approach. Can you really just say, we'll walk away from that part, but we won't walk away from that part? I mean, it's like, sure, when you're in a big park, you can walk away from the lake and go towards the woods, but you're still in the same park, right? So with China, I think you can walk away from some areas of cooperation with it, but you still have to continue cooperating in other areas. And the final issue, I suppose, is that with public health and with environmental issues, climate change, without China being involved, it's meaningless to try and deal with these. I mean, you can't, without a fifth of humanity involved, kind of really face these issues. And certainly you wouldn't be able to do a very good job without China being able to technologically and kind of politically work with you. So all of this means that, the idea of a complete decoupling, where, kind of the West basically says, we've had it with China, we can't deal with it anymore, we're not going to carry on supporting this regime. Well, I don't think that option is very realistic. The idea of piling pressure on China, well, 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, there was much more places where you could put pressure. And now I think it's not easy. It's really hard to think what sorts of pressures China will listen to. And we see this in all sorts of areas. And so, kind of that's also very, very challenging. You look at all of the lobbying and all of the denunciations of China, for instance, in Western media and Western politics. Well, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, these would have had some kind of impact. But it's hard to see that they're going to have any impact at all now. They don't seem to have any impact. When you look at the way that China has behaved on Hong Kong, or the way that it behaves on Xinjiang, it seems that it doesn't seem to listen. And at some point, you know, there is a very big moral quandary for Western politicians and others, you know, even in the Middle East, you know, when they kind of look at this partner and they say, well, we have to deal with you, but there are things that we can't, you know, accept that you're doing, but we have no impact on you. So this is quite a unique situation. You can see, I mean, how hard this is to deal with and how fraught with problems and dangers it is. So I suppose the sort of thing to really address now is, you know, where are we in this current situation? You know, what is happening? Now, COVID-19 has obviously had an enormous impact on the world, economically and in terms of society and politically and geopolitically. And we're still working out clearly what the end, you know, where this is going to lead us to. I say we're working out, you know, this isn't going to be something that's going to be resolved very, very easily. This is something that's going to take many, many years, maybe decades to really kind of, you know, sort of work and move through. COVID-19 has had some impact that you can see very clearly now. The first is that it has raised the profile and the priority of China. That seems a strange thing to say, but I think that there were many in Europe, for instance, and in the United States who never really thought much about China, maybe less so in the United States, but more in Europe. People really kind of regarded China as less of a priority and didn't really think it had much impact on our lives. And now we see a very vivid and dramatic case where clearly it does have a big impact on our lives. So now there is less complacency in Germany and France and Italy and in the UK. There are many, many governments who are thinking about China as never before. And their thoughts are mostly very critical and negative. And in America, we see this in the election that's coming up. You know, China is always in American elections, China plays some kind of role, but now its role is very, very clear. You know, everyone is trying to be as hard as possible against China. And, you know, there's even if there's a change of president in November, that's not going to change. I think this is now set in, you know, the kind of structure of the US-China relationship. So we have a kind of greater clarity. I guess the only thing that we can say about that is that we are very, very clear now where we all stand. And I guess we know that while people may disagree about what is the problem with China, most people will agree that there is a problem. So, I mean, that at least is some kind of clarity. So I suppose the second thing is, you know, kind of what it has done to China's diplomatic standing. I think before COVID-19, there were, you know, three groups of kind of countries. The first group of countries were those that I suppose you could say were the true believers, ones that really looked to China with very, very close relationship and had a very kind of friendly relationship with China. I suppose the best example would be Pakistan, that has been a faithful ally of China, has been very, very close to China for many decades. I mean, not just recently, even in the Maoist period. And so, you know, this group of countries, I think, as a result of COVID-19, have become even stronger in their desire to be close to China. It's made them even stronger in their commitments. The second group, you would say, were those who are agnostic, who sat in the middle. And that, I think, was the vast majority of countries, those that engaged with China pragmatically, but were kind of very, very skeptical or had misgivings about political issues with China and wanted to see some kind of change and really felt that they had to strategically kind of choose where they work with China. So I think this group included Europe, the United States, Germany, France, United States, you know, powers in Asia like Malaysia, Indonesia, you know, kind of, even if they had issues with China, I think that they were willing to kind of just sit in the middle, the more pragmatic space. And then you had, I suppose, kind of opponents of China. I would put in that group India. I know India under Modi has had good relations with China, but I think country to country, there's obviously significant issues. And I think India is clearly not happy with the very, very big role that China has in the region, and doesn't want to be involved in the Belt and Road and things like this. And so I think, this is a sort of very good example of a country that has always had huge issues with what China's been doing, and going back many decades. You would also put maybe more sort of less kind of like smaller partners, like the Czech Republic in Europe. The Czech Republic in Europe in recent years has had a reasonable relationship with China, but has always been, I think, very, very strongly opposed to some Chinese policies, particularly in Tibet and now in Xinjiang and about Taiwan. And we can see at the moment, a very sort of strong resistance to China and its attempts to interfere in Czech politics. So I think that's an interesting case study. There are others that could belong to this group, but I think in the past, before COVID-19, it wasn't a huge group. There weren't many countries that really sort of wanted to kind of oppose China almost as a sort of principle. I think COVID-19 has meant that a large number of countries have shifted from the middle ground towards the more opposing. The most significant, of course, is the United States. Their sentiments towards China are negative. Their criticisms towards China are extensive. And their dislike of China's rise is becoming more and more clear. So in 6 months, that is a fairly significant change. You've gone from a global system where I guess you could say that the majority of countries were pragmatic, kind of accepting, just sort of, kind of looking for some benefits and tactical relationships with China, but also aware that there were issues. You've now moved to a much harder position where China is talking to a world where its friends are fewer and its enemies have increased, and they have become very powerful enemies. However, China itself has become much stronger. So this is, what kind of a world is this? This is a fairly sort of brutally realist world. It's a world in which, the costs of trying to resolve this through force are simply not possible to think. I mean, I can't imagine that this situation is going to be sorted out by direct conflict, because it would be a lose-lose. However, you can't imagine that there being any easy reconciliation. In fact, at the moment, I can't see any reconciliation at all. So I suppose the question is, how long is this situation sustainable? Which is the last thing that I'll really talk about. Well, I mean, we can look at precedents. So, I mean, a lot of the time now you will see people talking about this being an era of new Cold War. Well, for sure, it's an era of contention, and the Cold War was an era of contention. That's true. But, I mean, the Cold War was very different to the position that we're looking at now. The USSR was not integrated at all into the global economy. I mean, it was integrated into the kind of, the USSR economy, but not, the kind of its satellites, the kind of communist bloc economy for sure, but not into the global economy. The USSR was probably looking to have some kind of conversion of other powers to the universal creed of, Marxism, Leninism. And I don't think China is looking to convert the world to socialism with Chinese characteristics. I don't think that's what it wants. The USSR for sure was a significant economy, but I think it was about, at its peak, it was about 63% of the American economy. And China, I think, at the moment is about 70% the size of the American economy. But you wouldn't have said that the USSR economy was a kind of high growth and particularly successful in the latter decades, whereas the Chinese economy has all been about growth in the last 20, 30 years. Nor was the USSR integrated into global supply chains and flows of capital and things like this, and China is. And also the final thing we have to remember is the USSR and America had their Cold War in an era in which concerns about climate change were not great, in which there weren't, there wasn't the internet, there weren't sort of virtual space. On all sorts of levels, the world now is actually a kind of very flat space, ironically. And so, that gives this a level of complexity that we never had to deal with in the Cold War. So I don't really think that this is a Cold War scenario. It is, however, obviously an era, as I said, of contention. And so we have to sort of work out, well, what kind of contentiousness are we really talking about? Well, I suppose one kind of exercise that you could do is imagine you were from another planet. You kind of arrived in your spaceship and you looked at the situation. Happily you could speak Chinese or English, so you're able to communicate. You arrived and you came to the world as it is at the moment. What would you kind of think if you kind of tried to imagine forgetting that you knew anything at all, just arrived at the world and you saw the situation? How would you assess it? So what you would see, I guess, would be these two huge, extremely different countries, geographically and economically and in terms of population. You would see China and you would see the United States, and you would work out quite quickly, because of the military power and the dominance economically of the United States, but also because of the increasing economic power and military dominance of China. You could kind of see, okay, so there are two players here. There's a lot of other players. There are, places like India and Russia and, kind of others. They obviously are important, but this is the two big ones, right? Okay, so what do we do? What's the issue? And then I guess you wouldn't take too long to work out that they really don't get on with each other. They don't have a happy dialogue. You wouldn't have to look very hard. All you'd have to do is follow the tweets of Mr. Pompeo, the American Secretary of State, to see that there was a big dislike. And look at the words of Wang Yi, the Foreign Minister of China, and then you think, okay, these people do not like each other. In fact, you probably would think, how the hell do they do anything with each other at all? I mean, your initial assumption might be that they actually have nothing to do with each other. But then you'd think, well, why is it that all these shops in America have Chinese-made goods? Why is it that there's these American companies operating in China? Why is it that there are people of Chinese ethnicity in America? And why are there loads of Americans working in China? Well, that doesn't mean that they completely don't get on with each other. There's some areas where they get on with each other, okay? And then maybe someone would explain to you, okay, there's also climate change and all these things that are huge and no one country can deal with them. So you would kind of think, right, so there's obviously a lot of space where these two get on with each other or actually have to get on with each other. So it's not all about them disliking each other deeply. So then you would, be asked, well, okay, with your wisdom from another planet, what would you do? And I suppose the rational answer would be, well, I mean, there's obviously very significant areas where these powers have to work with each other. There's very significant areas where they can't work with each other. It doesn't look like they're going to be able to sort out their differences anytime soon. And they may never be able to sort their differences out because they're so central to their identity. Therefore, what you really need is a kind of structure that accommodates those various kind of different things. A structure which accepts the areas where there is some kind of commonality, and a structure which also accepts the areas where there are differences. And you need some kind of flexibility because those spaces might change, but you have to acknowledge that there need to be those different spaces. You cannot have a totally flat system. You cannot have unipolarity. You can't have dominance. You've got to have pluralism. And so I think that's probably the world that we're moving into, a world of a fairly messy pluralism. I mean, well, a world of a fairly messy duality. Now, we have had historically, examples of that, I suppose. The Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty in China 2,000 years ago existed as massive empires separately. But of course, they had no real contact with each other, not any significant contact with each other. And this is different. So we're now kind of coming to a period where you've got almost a duplication of what happened 2,000 years ago, of these two vast, powerful kind of empires, you call them. But they know about each other, they engage with each other, and in some ways they're in each other's space. So you have to kind of almost have a duality, not only in the physical world, but in the virtual world, in the values world. You have to have a complete kind of rethink, and you have to have the space and time to do that in. Now, I guess my conclusion would be that that is not going to be an easy process. But it seems to me that it's a pretty necessary one. As I said, you don't really have the option of completely getting rid of the other partner. Conflict, yes, it's possible, but conflict will then be complete annihilation for everyone. So presumably that's not what we want. So, you've got to have some sort of middle way. And the middle way, I don't think, is going to be involving wishing the other partner to be like you. I'm assuming it would have to be acknowledging a big amount of difference and somehow dealing with that. And it is a question, I suppose, over the last 40 years, whether we ever really did that. I mean, we never really hit full on the idea that, in fact, China wasn't going to change and maybe couldn't change. I mean, I don't mean that negatively. I just mean that its identity, its political path was always going to be very, very complex. And it wasn't probably going to end up in an area where it was easy to predict. And so I suppose the, kind of mission to create a global structure in which you can accommodate these very, very different dynamics is a necessity. I mean, it's not something I think there's going to be any choice about. This will have to happen, and it is happening. The question is, how sustainable it will be, how stable it will be, and kind of in the end, will there be someone who ultimately comes out of it in a stronger position? I think that will take many decades, and happily, I will probably no longer be commenting on these things then. So as of today, I think I will just put my money on a dual system and hope that is constructed and then can be maintained in the decades ahead, because I think it will take that amount of time to sort this issue out. I'll conclude there. I'm happy to hear your comments and your ideas. So I'll return it to Antonio. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Brown. It was indeed very interesting and enlightening. So we have quite a few questions that we received through the registration form. So the first one is the deteriorating relationship between USA and China dividing the world into two factions? And what should be India's role in this situation?
Well, as I said, I mean, I don't think it's dividing the world into two factions, but it's certainly creating a more isolated China. But China, which is more isolated, but economically much bigger and much more influential, and can kind of get its own way in things that matter to it. So, well, if you want to say there's a China faction, but it's a faction of one, China, you can say that. But I think it's certainly kind of made China diplomatically more isolated. China was always slightly, I mean, even in the kind of 1950s and 60s, China was always an isolated actor. And, in the early 80s onwards, it engaged with multilateralism very enthusiastically. It's a member of everything. It's a member of all sorts of UN bodies and kind of the WTO, and it pays into the IMF and, all these things it does. It's in that sense, it's been very, very kind of sociable, it's very social, but it doesn't really, kind of engage very deeply. I think that's the issue. It doesn't, the underlying values of these multilateral organizations, if they have them, China doesn't really sign up to that. It's very exceptionist in its kind of activities. And so, I mean, in a strange way, even if you want to sort of seek to be close to China, it's not very easy to accept you. I think it's sort of, like a friend that, like always keeps their distance, and I think China is keen on, it doesn't like alliances, it doesn't like treaty alliances, it likes things that are more flexible and free flowing. So, it doesn't want the commitments of those sorts of alliances. So I think, that is the sort of behavior that it has maintained for quite a while, and that probably is its identity, and therefore it's not likely to really create factions. It's likely to try and create bonds economically that mean people want to work with it and stay close to it. But I don't think it really wants to create, a China faction in the world, which creates obligations for it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So the second question is, if China doesn't want to take over as world leader and that's just US perception, do we have a security dilemma here or not?
Well, so we have a security dilemma in as much as China's. So I think economically, China has a space, or has had a space until now, in the economic realm where I think people say, it has a positive sort of function. I think people can see, China investing and trading and working economically with others. This, is shouldn't be a problem. However, when you talk about a common security concept or a common idea of security, then things get very problematic. Because in these areas, China has not been able to create an easy consensus. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I guess, is the closest it's come to a sort of security multilateralism, but that is fairly kind of heavily dependent on China. When you look at, China's combating of terrorism, it's been quite problematic. Xinjiang is where we've ended up there, and I think most would say that this was not permissible. That China's definition of its security interests had led it to do things which were way beyond what was permissible, legal, or morally defensible. So, when China talks the language of security, it usually has big problems. What's the reason for that? I suppose the reason is that the Chinese system privileges stability, and the Chinese Communist Party, as the leading political force, the only political force in China, places massive priority on maintaining stability. But its sense of stability is obviously very different to, for instance, Europe or America. It's a complicated issue because everyone wants stability, but I think there is a different kind of concept of what stability is in European and American thinking. Because I think stability is preserved by institutions, and in China there are not strong institutions. There's the Communist Party, and that's it basically. And so it's all dependent on the actions of one player, which is the party and its leadership. Whereas I think in Europe and America, the institutions are meant to be the things that really give stability and predictability, which is what we're seeing now with very unpredictable leadership in Europe and America.
Okay, thanks. So the third question now is about a very direct question on US administration. Do you think that US administration's strategies towards China have been successful so far?
Well, yes and no. I think it's created more clarity. And so, what I guess the Trump administration has wanted is more balance. It's kind of constantly said that China is always signing asymmetrical deals, and therefore it gets more than it gives. That's not always true, but I think the perception is there that China, China is in the business of always winning, win-win. China wins twice. So I think this is what America has been really, really irritated by in the last sort of 3 or 4 years. And I think there's a sense that it has played a game with China which has not led to the outcome it wanted. What I mean by that is that the assumption of engagement with China economically in the last 40 years was that ultimately there would be political change. But China never agreed to that, obviously. You know, China never ever sort of said at the beginning of this process, well, we're doing this so that we can become politically like you. And I suppose America is saying, well, you know, if you go along this path to have the kind of capitalist economy that you've got, you need to have some political change because that's part of the package. You can't have one without the other. And I guess China's response is, well, we can, and we've proved that. So, you know, I guess this is the sort of step beyond once you've acknowledged, which I think America has, that it's not going to get political change through engagement. You use much harder tactics. Will these work, or are they working? It's really unclear at the moment because the tariffs on American goods didn't seem before COVID-19 to have impacted much on growth in America or jobs. But now, of course, things have changed. And I don't think we'll really know the answer to whether, you know, kind of America and China can continue this trade war until quite a long time into the future, maybe next year, because it really depends on what sort of economic damage is done by COVID-19 in America and whether China is able to get out of this more quickly than others, which looks at the moment like it might do. In that context, you know, China will be in a stronger position and America will be in a weaker one.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have the last two questions. One is from the chat box by Eleonora. So if Trump were to lose the elections, what would the US-China policy look like?
Well, I think it wouldn't change massively. I mean, it would be conducted in slightly different language. And it would be, I mean, the Biden administration, if it were to happen, would probably be more into multilateralism. You know, it would work more with its allies. There might be bigger problems for China. You know, I guess at the moment, there is now a common sense across Europe and America and elsewhere that China is a problem. And the only thing that's really saving a big coalition of international powers from sort of ganging up and giving even more pressure to China is their dislike of the Trump presidency. You know, so in a weird way, Trump's you know, kind of re-election would be a good thing for China. I think the assumption is that it's going to lead to, you know, a weaker America and, you know, more opportunities for China. I think, you know, there's a sort of sense that it wouldn't be a bad thing for China. But in terms of the, you know, kind of acceptance in America that things need to be done differently with China, that needs to be a harder line, I don't think that's going to change. It's one of the few areas in which there's been sort of bipartisan, you know, kind of support from the Democrats and from the Republicans. And I don't get any sense that, you know, this is going to go away. This issue is going to go away.
Okay, thank you very much. So now the last question is about Africa. So what are the effects of US-China conflict on African stability and development?
Well, Africa is 54 countries, so it depends on the country. I mean, you know, this year it's not so. Firstly, you know, COVID-19 is having a big impact across Africa, particularly in South Africa, and you know that's going to create issues. Secondly, diplomatically, Africa and China have not had an easy year because of the treatment of African nationals in China. You know, there's a lot of you know, kind of controversy over how people from different African countries still living and working in China were discriminated against, and so this created a fairly sort of negative environment to what is usually a fairly friendly relationship. The third thing, I suppose, is that America. I mean, America is becoming much more interested in cooperating in China, in Africa. You know, it sort of feels that this is a space that it's let China do too much in. So, you know, that may be giving a bit of competition to Chinese interests there. I suppose the final thing is that, again, like in other places, If the economic impact of COVID-19 in African countries is severe, well, there's no reason why they wouldn't want to deepen and, increase their cooperation with China. They don't have the political issues usually that, America and Europe have. They don't have that political baggage. So, there are almost certainly going to be opportunities. However, that will come with a price tag. I don't think China will be doing these things from any altruism. It will want to ensure that it has solid diplomatic alliances there. I think at the moment there's only one African country that still recognizes the Republic of China on Taiwan. 10 years ago, that was 4 African countries. So, in some ways, China's made diplomatic inroads into Africa, and it will expect support from African countries at the UN and other places when it feels it's being criticized. So I think it's going to be likely that there'll be a greater economic involvement by China in Africa, but I think it's also likely that there will be more political demands.
Thank you very much again, Professor Brown. It was indeed open-minded. I now give the floor to Annie Zhu for the conclusive part. Annie, now you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Antonio. And thank you, Professor Kerry Brown, for a very insightful discussion on US-China conflicts. I think that this is especially relevant given the recent instability caused by COVID-19, rising superpowers and ever-changing events, not only between the US and China, but everywhere in Asia, the Indo-Pacific and Oceania as well. Thank you for giving up your valuable time, sharing your experience and knowledge. On behalf of the International Association of Political Student Society, Asia and Oceania, we would like to extend our thanks.
Thank you very much. Look, it's good to speak with you, and I'm very glad to have had this sort of opportunity to know you a bit better. I'm easy to get in touch with. If you have any questions, then you can. I know that you've got my contact details, so please do tell me if there's any questions, or if you've got any corrections to make. That you feel that I've said things not correct. I'd be very happy to hear your opinions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd just like to also thank our audience for attending. We hope that you've also learned immensely about this issue and learnt from Professor Brown's experience. Thank you.
Very much. See you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye. Over to you, Antonio.
Okay, so now I think that, okay, I see a question, but the professor has already left. So, okay, thank you very much for joining us, to the participants, and I hope to see you soon to our next webinar.
Okay. Well, thank you all the participants for joining us, and it's time to end the webinar. I just want to clarify one thing, that there is no feedback link for the webinar, and plus there won't be any kind of certificate for attending the webinar. I think many participants have this confusion. Okay, I'm ending this webinar. Thank you. Thank you so much.